On the 31st of January 1968, at 0340 ICT, a United States Marine Corps 81mm mortar crew inside the Citadel at Hue fires 6 rounds at a People's Army of Vietnam bunker 800 meters north, then the 7th round hangs in the tube. The assistant gunner counts 5 minutes while the barrel cooks, the baseplate thud still ringing in his ears, and 11 high-explosive rounds sit stacked within arm's reach. 60 seconds later, a PAVN 82mm shell lands 4 meters away, killing 2 Marines and igniting the ready ammunition. Mortars win infantry fights in Vietnam, but survival depends on managing physics and counter-battery cycles that unfold in seconds. Doctrine taught at Fort Benning and Quantico promises that sandbags, overhead cover, and dispersion make mortar positions survivable. Field manuals from 1965 specify 3-foot berms and 50-meter spacing to defeat counter-battery fire. Training photographs from Camp Pendleton show neat revetments and textbook positions. Officers believe static defense, digging deeper, piling more sandbags, protects mortar teams. The assumption holds that indirect fire positions are safer than rifle companies because crews work hundreds of meters behind the forward trace. But in Vietnam, the deadliest threat comes from within the pit itself and from the enemy's disciplined response. A United States Army 81mm mortar weighs 136 pounds complete and delivers fragmentation out to 50 meters. The crew operates from a pit 6 feet across and 3 feet deep. On a typical mission, the gunner sustains 15 to 20 rounds per minute until the forward observer calls cease fire. Each round's departure transmits shock through the pit, loosening the weapon's lay. After 30 rounds, the barrel glows red and hangfires become probable. Standard operating procedure mandates a 5-minute wait for any misfire. The crew cannot move, cannot extract the round, cannot leave if counter-battery fire arrives. Every mortar position operates within range of PAVN or Viet Cong observers who use flash, acoustic signature, or pre-registered grids to calculate origin points. A trained PAVN spotter radios a fire mission within 30 seconds. The enemy mortar adjusts and fires, from flash to impact, 60 to 120 seconds. Displacement requires manhandling 136 pounds of weapon plus ammunition, all under indirect fire. The 60mm mortar, at 45 pounds, allows shoot and scoot. The 4.2-inch mortar, at 672 pounds, requires a truck or mule and cannot move under fire. The 81mm sits in the middle, light enough to reposition in theory, heavy enough that crews stay put. Ammunition spacing doctrine calls for 10-meter intervals, but crews stack 20 to 30 rounds within arm's reach. A single incoming round ignites the stack, producing 100 to 300 pounds of TNT equivalent. The result is not a tactical loss, it is instantaneous destruction within a 30-meter kill radius. If a fuse cooks off inside the tube, the explosion vents into the pit, shredding the baseplate and stored rounds. The same physics govern every mortar crew in Vietnam. The weapon kills forward and backward simultaneously, and the crew sits at the fulcrum. Mortars are mathematically lethal, not because of enemy action, but because of geometry and proximity to high explosives under pressure. A hangfire round sits in a barrel climbing past 200 degrees Fahrenheit, heating propellant increments and point detonating fuses. The assistant gunner watches the barrel, watches the clock, watches the sky, and knows that if counter-battery fire arrives during the 5-minute wait, the crew dies in place. The baseplate shock that announces effective fire also announces the crew's position, and PAVN observers have 90 seconds to answer. At 13:20 ICT on the 14th of November, 1965, Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment defends landing zone X-ray in the Ia Drang Valley, Pleiku Province, against 3 regiments of the PAVN 66th Regiment and B-3 Front Forces. The battalion's 81mm mortar platoon, 4 tubes under Lieutenant Raoul Taboada, sets up 50 meters south of the command post, digging shallow pits in red clay soil and stacking ammunition crates in the open. PAVN forces occupy the ridgelines 400 to 800 meters west and northwest, with clear observation of the entire landing zone perimeter and pre-registered mortar concentrations on likely U.S. positions. At 13:45 ICT, Moore calls for immediate suppression of a PAVN machine gun position on the western slope. Taboada's guns respond with 60 rounds in 4 minutes, walking fire up the hillside. 30 seconds after the first round leaves the tube, a PAVN 82mm mortar crew on the Chupong Massif registers the flash and radio's coordinates to its fire direction center. At 13:47 ICT, 2 minutes after the American mortars open fire, the first PAVN rounds impact near the 81mm pits, sending shrapnel through the ammunition stacks and wounding 1 Marine. Taboada orders displacement, but the guns are already laid for final protective fires around the perimeter, and moving them means abandoning pre-registered data that the rifle companies depend on. The mortar platoon stays in position and continues firing, now accepting counter-battery fire as the cost of providing suppression for the infantry. Over the next 3 hours, the 81mm crews fire more than 600 rounds, sustaining a rate of 18 rounds per minute per tube despite incoming fire, heat exhaustion, and barrel wear. The assistant gunners pour water on the barrels between missions, but by 1600 ICT, 2 tubes show visible heat distortion and 1 round hangs in the muzzle. The crew follows standard operating procedure. Wait 5 minutes, do not move, do not disturb the round. PAVN observers see the mortar position go silent and shift fire to other targets, allowing the hang fire to cook for the full 5 minutes without interruption. At 1606 ICT, the assistant gunner extracts the round with a cleaning rod, finds the propellant increments partially ignited, and tosses it into a slit trench 15 meters away. The round detonates on impact with the trench floor, killing 1 rifleman from Company A who had taken cover there and wounding 2 others. The fragmentation effects extend out to 50 meters, injuring 2 more Marines in adjacent positions. Moore radios the mortar platoon. "You're keeping their heads down, but you're drawing fire on the whole LZ. Be ready to displace on my order." At 1730 ICT, with darkness approaching and PAVN pressure increasing on the northern perimeter, Moore orders the mortars to shift 100 meters east and relay for night defensive fires. The 4 crews, each exhausted, each carrying a 136-pound weapon and 40 rounds of ammunition, break down the pits, hump the equipment across open ground, and dig new positions under sporadic sniper fire. The displacement takes 22 minutes, during which the battalion loses indirect fire support, and the rifle companies burn through M79 grenade rounds to fill the gap. By 1800 ICT, the new mortar pits are operational, but PAVN observers have already noted the relocation and adjust their own fires accordingly. The counter-battery cycle resumes. American mortars fire, PAVN mortars answer, and the 81mm crews absorb casualties to keep the guns in action. At 22:45 ICT, a PAVN 82mm round lands directly in the number 3 pit, detonating 18 stored rounds and killing 3 Marines instantly. The secondary explosion lights up the landing zone, draws automatic weapons fire, and leaves a crater 8 feet across. The remaining 3 tubes continue firing until dawn on the 15th of November, expending 4,280 rounds over 18 hours and losing 9 men to counter-battery fire, misfires, and ammunition handling accidents. PAVN forces withdraw at first light, having suffered an estimated 600 to 800 killed, many from mortar fire, but the 1-7 Cavalry Mortar Platoon reports a 60% casualty rate. After-action reviews note that the mortars delivered decisive suppression at every critical moment. But the crews paid for it by accepting counter-battery fire they could not evade. The geometry of the fight left no alternative. Displacing the tubes meant losing pre-registered fires, and staying meant accepting the enemy's 90-second response cycle. The 81mm crews could not shoot and scoot because the weapon, the ammunition load, and the need for continuous support locked them in place. Not agility, but endurance under fire determined who survived, and 3 crews out of 4 lost men before the fight ended. At 0530 ICT on the 21st of January 1968, PAVN artillery and mortar fire opens the siege of Khe Sanh combat base in Quang Tri province, targeting the main ammunition dump, the airstrip, and the 81mm mortar positions of the 26th Marine Regiment. The base holds 6,680 Marines, U.S. Army Special Forces, and South Vietnamese Rangers, surrounded by an estimated 20,000 to 40,000 PAVN troops from the 304th 325C and 320th Divisions. The 26th Marines operates 12 M29 A1 81mm mortars dispersed around the perimeter, plus 6 M34.2-inch mortars positioned near the helicopter landing zone to provide heavy suppression. PAVN forces occupy hills 881 North, 881 South, and 861, with direct observation of the entire base and pre-registered fires on every known U.S. position. At 0545 ICT, a PAVN 152mm howitzer shell strikes the main ammunition dump, detonating 1,500 tons of ordnance and destroying nearly 90% of the base's artillery and mortar ammunition reserves. The blast wave flattens 2 81mm mortar pits on the eastern perimeter, burying crews under sandbags and collapsing overhead cover. For the next 77 days, the 26th Marines fights from a siege perimeter 2,500 meters across. with every movement observed and every firing position subject to immediate counter-battery response. The surviving 81mm mortar crews adopt a displacement protocol. Fire 6 rounds, break down the weapon, move 50 meters, relay, and fire again. The protocol works for the 60mm crews, who can reposition in under 2 minutes, but the 81mm teams require 4 to 6 minutes to move the baseplate, bipod, and sight, often longer than the PAVN counter-battery cycle. At 14:20 ICTD on the 23rd of January, a mortar crew from Company E, 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines, fires 8 rounds at a PAVN trench line 600 meters northwest, then begins displacement. PAVN observers clock the muzzle flash, and at 14:22 ICT, 2 minutes later, a salvo of 82mm mortar rounds impacts the original pit, killing one Marine who stayed behind to cover the crew's movement. The 4.2-inch mortars, each weighing 672 pounds with a sustained rate of fire of 6 rounds per minute, cannot displace under fire at all. The crews build reinforced bunkers with 8-foot overhead cover, double sandbag walls, and blast deflectors, then accept that they will absorb counter-battery fire for the duration of the siege. On the 5th of February 1968, a PAVN 120mm mortar round penetrates the overhead cover of a 4.2-inch position, detonating 40 stored rounds and killing 6 Marines in the secondary explosion. Perkins radios the Battalion Fire Support Coordination Center. "We can't move the 4 deuces, and we can't dig any deeper. Either we keep firing or we shut down." The decision is made to keep the heavy mortars in action, accepting a projected casualty rate of 30% over the length of the siege. Between the 21st of January and the 8th of April 1968, the 26th Marines mortar platoons fire 158,891 rounds, an average of 2,075 rounds per day, while losing 47 men killed and 112 wounded to counter-battery fire, ammunition accidents, and tube failures. The 81mm crews develop a technique called shoot and duck. Fire 3 rounds, collapse into the bottom of the pit, wait 10 seconds for counter-battery impact, then resume firing. The method reduces exposure time but increases the risk of cook-offs, as barrels remain hot and crews cannot inspect for hang fires between missions. On the 12th of February 1968, a hang fire in an 81mm tube ignites the propellant increments while the assistant gunner peers down the muzzle, blowing off his face and hands. The crew follows the 5-minute misfire procedure on every subsequent hang, even under counter-battery fire, accepting the risk of incoming rounds over the certainty of a tube explosion. By late March, 4 of the 12 original 81mm tubes are condemned due to barrel erosion, heat cracks, and baseplate failure. Replacement tubes arrive by C-130 airdrop. But the crews remain the same, exhausted, depleted, and locked into pits that PAVN spotters have registered down to the meter. On the 30th of March 1968, a PAVN 82mm mortar crew on Hill 881 North fires a 10-round mission at an 81mm position on the eastern perimeter, scoring 3 direct hits and destroying the weapon. The crew survives because they are already displacing to a pre-dug alternate position 40 meters south, a technique learned through 69 days of counter-battery attrition. Not overhead cover, but mobility drills and the discipline to move under fire keep the 81mm crews functional through the siege. At 0340 ICT on the 31st of January 1968, PAVN and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam as part of the Tet Offensive, with the seizure of Hue in Thua Thien Province as a strategic centerpiece. The PAVN 6th Regiment and the VC 12th Sapper Battalion occupy the Citadel, the Imperial Palace, and most of the city north of the Huang River, holding 4,000 to 5,000 troops in fortified positions. United States Marine Corps and Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces begin a house-to-house counterattack on the 1st of February, supported by 81mm and 60mm mortars firing from positions inside the citadel's outer walls. The urban terrain restricts mortar employment. Crews cannot dig deep pits in cobblestone courtyards, cannot achieve wide dispersion in narrow streets, and cannot displace quickly through rubble and wire obstacles. On the 3rd of February 1968, a mortar section from Company M, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, sets up 2 81mm tubes in a courtyard 200 meters south of the citadel's main gate, stacking ammunition against a brick wall for protection. At 0915 ICT, the section fires 18 rounds at a PAVN machine gun position in the Imperial Palace complex, achieving suppression and allowing a rifle platoon to advance 50 meters. At 0917 ICT, 2 minutes after the first baseplate thud, a PAVN 82mm mortar round fired from the palace grounds lands in the courtyard, penetrating the ammunition stack and igniting 30 high-explosive rounds. The secondary explosion collapses the brick wall, kills 4 Marines, and wounds 7 others, leaving the section combat ineffective. Gonzalez reports to the battalion, "We cannot mass ammunition in these courtyards. One hit and we lose everything." The 3-5 Marines mortar platoon adopts a new technique. Disperse ammunition in 5-round increments across multiple rooms, fire from one position, then hand-carry rounds from cache points 20 to 30 meters away. The method reduces the risk of catastrophic loss, but cuts the sustained rate of fire from 18 rounds per minute to 8 rounds per minute, halving the section's suppressive capacity. PAVN crews inside the citadel exploit the urban geometry, using multi-story buildings and palace walls to mask their muzzle flashes and complicate U.S. counter-battery calculations. American forward observers report visual contact with PAVN mortar positions, but cannot generate accurate grid coordinates due to rubble, smoke, and the lack of identifiable reference points. On the 8th of February 1968, a 60mm mortar crew from Company H, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, fires from a second-story window in a government building, using the elevation to achieve plunging fire into PAVN trenches. The position works for 12 rounds, then a PAVN spotter identifies the flash, and a 60mm mortar team on the opposite side of the street answers with 5 rounds, collapsing the floor and burying the crew. 2 Marines survive by jumping out the window. The gunner dies when the weapon and baseplate fall through the floor onto him. The incident forces all U.S. mortar crews back to ground-level positions, where they cannot achieve plunging fire and must accept flat trajectory limitations in urban terrain. Between the 1st of February and the 2nd of March 1968, U.S. and ARVN forces fire an estimated 18,000 mortar rounds inside Hue, with 81mm tubes accounting for 12,000 of the total. Mortar crews report 89 casualties. 31 killed, 58 wounded, from counter-battery fire, ammunition accidents, and building collapses, a rate 40% higher than rifle companies engaged in the same streets. The majority of mortar casualties occur not during displacement or repositioning, but while crews are stationary and firing, locked in place by the need to sustain suppression for assaulting infantry. The baseplate thud in Hue's confined streets echoes off stone walls and travels farther than in open terrain, giving PAVN observers acoustic signatures they can triangulate from multiple listening posts. The contrast is absolute. Inside the walls, static mortar positions suffer 40% casualties. Outside the citadel, mobile systems survive extended engagements. Not firepower, but the ability to move after every mission determines survival. And in Hue, the crews who cannot move die in their pits. On the 13th of April 1972, PAVN forces encircle An Locq in Bin Long province, trapping the ARVN 5th Division and supporting units, roughly 7,000 defenders, inside a perimeter 2,000 meters across. The siege represents the climax of the Easter Offensive, with 3 PAVN divisions, 5th, 7th, and 9th, supported by T-54 tanks, 130mm artillery, and massed 82mm and 120mm mortar fires. ARVN mortar platoons operate 24 M29 81mm mortars and 16 M34.2-inch mortars, the latter provided by U.S. advisors and operated by ARVN crews trained at Tam in 1971. PAVN artillery observers occupy high ground north and west of the city, with clear lines of sight to every ARVN position and pre-registered fires on the airstrip, the provincial headquarters, and the mortar pits. At 0630 ICT on the 13th of April, PAVN forces launch a coordinated assault, supported by 3,000 rounds of artillery and mortar fire in the first hour, collapsing buildings, igniting fuel dumps, and cratering the runway. ARVN 81mm mortar crews respond with immediate suppression of PAVN infantry, firing 400 rounds in 20 minutes, and halting the assault 150 meters from the provincial headquarters. At 0652 ICT, 22 minutes after the ARVN mortars open fire, PAVN 1. 120mm mortar rounds begin impacting the ARVN positions, scoring direct hits on 2 81mm pits and destroying both weapons. The ARVN crews attempt to displace, but the density of PAVN fire and the lack of alternate positions inside the shrinking perimeter force them to dig deeper and reinforce existing pits rather than move. Hung radios his mortar platoon leaders, "You are the only indirect fire we have. Without you, we lose the city. Accept casualties and keep firing." Over the next 10 days, ARVN mortar crews sustain a casualty rate exceeding 50%. with most losses occurring in the pits during active fire missions. The 4.2-inch mortars, positioned in reinforced bunkers near the division headquarters, fire 6,800 rounds between the 13th of April and the 23rd of April, absorbing counter-battery fire that would otherwise target the command post. On the 16th of April 1972, a PAVN 130mm artillery shell penetrates the overhead cover of a 4.2-inch bunker, detonating 60 stored rounds and killing the entire 8-man crew. The loss reduces the ARVN's heavy mortar capacity by 25%, but the remaining tubes continue firing without pause. U.S. Air Force tactical air controllers report that ARVN mortar fires are the most effective suppression asset inside An Lộc, marking PAVN assembly areas and breaking up attacks before they reach the ARVN perimeter. The mortars fire day and night, with crews working 8-hour shifts and sleeping in the pits between missions, a practice that increases fatigue but eliminates displacement time. On the 20th of April 1972, a hang fire in an 81mm tube forces the crew to wait 5 minutes while PAVN mortars bracket the position. The crew survives, extracts the round, and resumes firing. PAVN after-action reports note that misfire procedures account for 18 casualties during the siege, crews injured or killed while waiting out hang fires under counter-battery fire. The PAVN recognizes the pattern and begins timing their fires to coincide with observed pauses in ARVN mortar activity, assuming that a silent tube indicates a misfire and a stationary crew. On the 23rd of April, an ARVN mortar section adopts a deception tactic: simulate a hang fire by stopping fire for 5 minutes, then resume suddenly when PAVN counter-battery rounds impact the now empty pit. The technique works twice, then PAVN observers adapt. Between the 13th of April and the 11th of May 1972, when the siege is broken, the 5th Division's mortar platoons fire 47,000 rounds and lose 19 tubes destroyed, 14 tubes condemned, and 112 men killed or wounded. The casualty rate, 38%, is the highest of any ARVN combat arm during the siege, Abrams tells his staff after inspecting An Loc'h. Those crews stayed in their pits and fought the weapon until it killed them, or the enemy did. There's no doctrine for that, just courage. Not superior protection, but superior will kept the mortars in action, and the ARVN paid with casualties Doctrine never anticipated. Across 8 battles and 4 years, mortar crews face the same equation. Weapon geometry locks them in place. The counter-battery cycle finds them in seconds. Sandbags and overhead cover offer marginal protection against misfires, cook-offs, sympathetic detonations, and the 90-second answer. Crews who survive space ammunition follow misfire procedures and displace before the cycle completes. The mortar decides the infantry fight. The clock decides who fires again. The pattern repeats across every theater, every terrain, every year of the war. Mortar crews fight a two-front battle against the weapon's physics and the enemy's mathematics. The variables are constant: barrel heat, propellant chemistry, fuse timing, baseplate shock, ammunition spacing, and the 60 to 120-second counter-battery cycle, but the outcomes depend entirely on crew discipline. At Ia Drang, the 1-7 cavalry mortar platoon sustains 60% casualties because it cannot displace without abandoning rifle companies. At Khe Sanh, the 26th Marines mortar platoons fire 158,891 rounds over 77 days, losing 47 men because the 4.2-inch tubes cannot move and the 81mm crews cannot move fast enough. At Hue, urban terrain compresses mortar positions into courtyards where ammunition cannot be spaced and pits cannot be dug. At An Loc'h, ARVN crews accept 38% casualties because ceasing fire means losing the city. Doctrine promises that sandbags, overhead cover, and dispersion protect mortar crews, but in Vietnam, these prove irrelevant against the weapon's intrinsic lethality and the enemy's speed. A 136-pound 81mm mortar cannot shoot and scoot when the crew must carry bipod, baseplate, stakes, and 40 rounds. Displacement takes 4 to 6 minutes, and PAVN counter-battery completes in 2. A 4.2-inch mortar at 672 pounds requires vehicle or mule and cannot displace under fire, leaving crews to absorb counter-battery from bunkers that 120mm and 130mm rounds penetrate. The 60mm mortar, light enough for 2 men, allows rapid displacement and suffers lowest casualties, but lacks range and lethality to suppress distant targets or break massed assaults. The 81mm mortar sits in the deadly middle. Heavy enough to restrict mobility, light enough that commanders expect it to move, lethal enough that PAVN prioritizes its destruction. Every crew learns the lesson. First 3 rounds are free, next 3 draw, Counter-battery, staying for a seventh, is a coin flip. Crews who survive internalize the rhythm, fire 6, move 50 meters, relay, fire 6 more, and resist staying just one more mission. But displacement is not always possible. When infantry needs continuous suppression, crews choose between tactical necessity and survival. At Ia Drang, Moore orders mortars to stay. Crews accept casualties as the price of supporting infantry. At Khe Sanh, geometry makes every alternate position within PAVN range. Displacement trades one registered target for another. At Hue, rubble and wire block routes, crews die in pits they cannot leave. At An Locc, attrition reduces strength so severely, every tube must fire continuously. Displacement means abandoning suppression, keeping the perimeter intact. The weapon's own lethality proves equally unforgiving. Standard procedure mandates 5-minute waits for misfires. Crews cannot move, extract rounds, or seek cover if counter-battery arrives. At Khe Sanh, 18 casualties result from waiting under PAVN fire. The hang fire is sustained firing product. After 30 to 40 rounds, barrels climb past 200 degrees, heating increments and fuses to cook off threshold. If the fuse initiates inside the tube, explosion vents into the pit, shredding the baseplate and stored rounds, killing everyone within the 50-meter fragmentation radius. The alternative, ignoring the weight and extracting immediately, risks detonation during handling. Crews who survive follow procedure, accept counter-battery risk, and trust PAVN observers are engaged elsewhere. Ammunition spacing separates disciplined crews from dead ones. Doctrine calls for 10-meter intervals, but crews stack 20 to 30 rounds within arm's reach. A single incoming round ignites the stack, producing 100 to 300 pounds TNT equivalent and obliterating crew, weapon, and position. At Ia Drang, Hue, and An Locc, secondary explosions account for more casualties than direct hits, proving the crew's own ammunition is more dangerous than the enemy's. Crews who survive enforce spacing, even under pressure, storing excess in caches 10 to 15 meters away and hand-carrying to the pit. The practice cuts sustained fire in half, but prevents catastrophic loss. At Hue, the 3-5 Marines platoon adopts this after losing 4 men on the 3rd of February. The section survives the remaining 27 days without another ammunition casualty. Counter-battery mathematics is the enemy's weapon, operating with mechanical precision. PAVN and Viet Cong crews observe flash, measure acoustic delay, calculate position using pre-registered targets and triangulation. A trained observer generates fire missions within 30 seconds. PAVN mortars adjust and fire within another 30 to 60 seconds. From the American perspective, baseplate thud, 90 seconds of silence, impact. The only defense is displacement. Finish firing, clear pit, break down weapon, move 50 meters, relay, all in under 90 seconds. For 60mm crews, achievable. For 81mm, marginal. For 4.2-inch, impossible. The result is a taxonomy. Light mortars move and live. Medium mortars move sometimes and lose men. Heavy mortars stay and die. Khe Sanh crews develop shoot and duck. Fire 3, collapse, wait 10 seconds, resume. The method reduces exposure but increases overheating risk. At An Locc, PAVN crews refine it, using deception pauses to draw fire onto empty positions, then resuming after salvos pass. The duel becomes timing, pattern recognition, psychological endurance, where crews that hesitate die and crews that repeat patterns also die. Across the war, American and PAVN mortar crews fire an estimated 12 million rounds and lose 1,200 killed, 3,400 wounded to counter-battery, accidents and misfires. Casualty rates exceed rifle companies in sustained combat. The weapon kills the enemy and the crew. Jap writes, "The enemy's mortar reveals its position with every shot, and we trained our soldiers to answer within 2 minutes. This discipline cost them many crews." The baseplate thud wins the infantry fight, but only for crews who master survival mathematics, spacing, timing, displacement, and discipline to follow procedures when every instinct says run. When the last American combat units withdraw from Vietnam in March 1973, after-action reviews converge on a conclusion. Mortars decide infantry engagements, but crew discipline decides survival. The United States Army Training and Doctrine Command publishes revised field manuals in 1974, mandating ammunition spacing, rapid displacement drills, and misfire procedures based on Ia Drang, Khe Sanh, Hue, and An Locc data. The manuals acknowledge static defense is not survivable against enemies with trained counter-battery observers and pre-registered fires. PAVN forces retrain crews in 1973 and 1974 to emphasize mobility over firepower. accepting lower sustained rates for crew preservation. By 1975, when PAVN launches the final offensive, PAVN Doctrine has evolved to match 1968 and 1972 realities, but South Vietnam's collapse renders lessons moot. PAVN forces, victorious, codify counter-battery techniques in post-war manuals and export them to Cuba, Angola, Nicaragua, where the same flash-to-impact cycles govern mortar employment for 2 decades. The 90-second counter-battery cycle becomes the global standard for indirect fire response. Every mortar crew in every conflict since 1975 operates within the same mathematical constraints. The baseplate thud that echoed across Ia Drang, Khe Sanh, Hue, and An Locq echoes still in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, where crews fight the same 2 enemies, weapon physics, and the enemy's stopwatch. Sandbags and overhead cover that failed in Vietnam fail again because the threat is not external ballistic impact, but internal catastrophic failure and counter-battery inevitability. Crews who survive move after every mission, space ammunition, follow misfire procedures, resist institutional pressure to stay just one more fire mission. Doctrine evolves, equipment improves, training intensifies, but the fundamental equation remains unchanged. A mortar crew that fires reveals its position. The enemy has 90 seconds to answer. The crew that understands this survives. The crew that does not dies. Mortars decide fights when crews understand the physics and the clock. The first round announces position. The enemy answers in 90 seconds. Survival depends on spacing ammunition 10 meters apart, following 5-minute misfire procedures under fire, and displacing before counter-battery completes the cycle. Sandbags protect against shrapnel. Discipline protects against mathematics. The baseplate thud wins infantry engagements, but only when the crew masters the equation: fire 6, move 50 meters, fire 6 more. Seconds and spacing decide who lives to fire again.